I guess every story has a beginning, but I'm still trying to figure out exactly where mine started. Was it the day I met her, that sunny afternoon when her smile was like a flare cutting through the fog of my routine life? Or was it some years later, when I started noticing the way she'd quickly lock her phone, how her laughter sounded different, more forced, when she'd say she had to work late? Let me back up a bit. I'm a project manager at a tech firm, where most days are a blur of meetings, emails, and endless deadlines. I'm not exactly the adventurous type, never have been. I've always been the guy who plays it safe, takes the secure job, invests in the low-risk stocks. And then there's her, Sophia, my wife of 8 years. She's everything I'm not, vibrant, spontaneous, the kind of woman who draws attention without even trying. She works in marketing at a big advertising agency downtown, always surrounded by a crowd of creatives who seem to think life is one big party. At first, it was this contrast between us that I loved most. I was the calm, and she was the storm. She'd drag me to art shows, surprise me with weekend getaways, and for a while, I thought we were the perfect balance for each other. I'd look at her and see my world, the only world I wanted. But lately, things had started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way she'd begun to check her phone more often, the screen lighting up late into the night, or how she'd started working longer hours, coming home smelling faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't mine. The explanations came easily enough. We're pitching to a new client, or it's just the stress, everyone's on edge. But her excuses were too rehearsed, too smooth. Then there were the nights she wouldn't come home at all, claiming she'd stayed with her colleague, Laura, after a late presentation ran into an impromptu party. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. But when you've lived with someone for nearly a decade, you know when something's changed. And that's when the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my sheets soaked with sweat, and the image of her with another man seared into my mind. I didn't know who he was, what he looked like, just that he existed. I could feel it in my bones. There were small clues here and there, little things that didn't add up. The extra miles on her car, the way she seemed to get more dressed up for work, even on days without meetings. I'd catch her smiling at her phone, her fingers flying over the keyboard as if in some secret, silent conversation. I began to do what any suspicious husband would, checking her texts when she was in the shower, looking at her call logs. Nothing concrete, just a lot of deleted messages and a few late-night calls to numbers I didn't recognize. I wanted to believe her, I wanted to trust her, but something inside me whispered that trust was a fool's game now. So I decided to play along, to watch and wait. I'd catch her in small lies, test her with casual questions about her day, her plans. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that led to a name that sent a chill down my spine. The name was Daniel. I heard it for the first time one night, mentioned in passing. "Oh, Daniel's new to the team. He's one of the designers," she'd said casually, as if the word itself wasn't a match waiting to strike a spark. Her eyes flitted away from mine for just a second too long. I asked a couple of harmless questions about him, pretending I was just being polite, but she kept it short, brief, too brief. From then on, I started to hear it more often. Daniel this, Daniel that. Apparently, he was the creative genius they'd been waiting for. "Daniel's so talented," she would say, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. "He has this unique way of looking at things." Her voice softened just a little when she spoke his name. It was subtle, but I noticed. I notice everything. So I did some digging. I found out Daniel was a new hire, fresh out of some fancy art school. Mid-30s, tall, handsome in that rugged, effortless way that I used to hate when I was in college. From what I gathered, he was the type who'd draw attention anywhere he went. Self-confident, full of swagger. I hated him instantly, but I kept my suspicions to myself. I had no solid proof, just a gut feeling, and gut feelings don't hold up well in conversations that end with, "You're being paranoid." So I waited and watched. Then there were the strange moments that started to stack up like cards in a losing hand. One night I decided to surprise her. I left the office early, picked up her favorite takeout, and headed straight to her agency. It was supposed to be a cute little surprise. Husband of the year move, you know. But when I got there, I saw her in the lobby with him, Daniel. I watched them through the glass doors. He was too close, his hand resting on her lower back as they laughed at something I couldn't hear. I could see his eyes lingering on her, the way a man looks at a woman he wants, and she didn't pull away. She leaned in closer, touching his arm lightly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand tightening around the takeout bag until my knuckles turned white. The anger bubbled up inside me, hot and raw, but I swallowed it down. I walked away before they could see me, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I started to notice other things after that. Her sudden enthusiasm for fitness, going to the gym more often, buying new workout clothes. She'd come home glowing, claiming she was getting in shape for a company retreat. But I knew better. I'd see the way she'd smile when a message pinged on her phone, the way she'd leave the room to answer certain calls. Her lies were becoming more elaborate, more carefully crafted, but they were still lies. I wanted to confront her, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe deep down I needed to be sure, completely, unquestionably sure. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I followed her. I waited until one of those nights when she said she was staying late for a meeting, and I tailed her car. She drove downtown, not to her office, but to a hotel. A mid-range place, nothing too flashy, but discreet. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum as I watched her get out of the car, look around nervously, and disappear inside. 10 minutes later, I saw him. Daniel. He parked his car next to hers, checking his surroundings like a man who knew he was doing something wrong, but couldn't help himself. I watched him go inside, and that's when I knew. I sat in my car for hours that night, waiting for them to come out, replaying every moment of the past year in my head, trying to figure out how it had come to this. My fists clenched, my nails digging into my palms until they left red crescent moons in my skin. And then, just before dawn, they emerged. Together, laughing, touching. My whole world shattered right there in that parking lot. I felt something inside me snap. I knew I couldn't let this go, not this time. I didn't say a word to her that night when she got home. She slipped into bed beside me, her hair still damp from a quick shower, and I could feel the lies radiating off her like heat from a fire. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, plotting my next move. That was the night I decided I needed proof, something concrete, something undeniable. I needed to see it with my own eyes, no more guessing, no more hoping it was all in my head. So, I hired a private investigator, a guy named Mark, who'd come highly recommended by a friend who'd gone through his own messy divorce. Mark had a reputation for being thorough, discreet, and ruthless. Exactly what I needed. Over the next few weeks, he kept me updated. Pictures, logs, recordings, all of it painted a picture I wasn't ready to see but needed to face. He followed her to their favorite spots, the coffee shop on 3rd Street, the park near her office, and, of course, the hotel. He even captured a few of their conversations from a distance, just snippets, enough to hear the intimacy in their voices, the laughter that cut through me like a blade. Then came the night that changed everything. I was sitting in my car outside the hotel again, my usual spot across the street. Mark was inside, tailing them, trying to get closer, to hear more. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket and saw his name flash on the screen. "They're in the suite on the 3rd floor, room 312, Mark's voice crackled over the line. "You want me to keep going?" I took a deep breath, my hand trembling. Number, that's enough. I'm going in. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't think I was thinking at all. I just knew I needed to confront them, to see the betrayal up close, to make it real. My heart hammered in my chest as I crossed the street and entered the hotel. The lobby was dimly lit, quiet except for the soft murmur of voices from the bar. I took the stairs two at a time, adrenaline surging through my veins like fire. Room 312. I stood outside the door for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I could hear them inside, muffled laughter, the sound of clinking glasses. My stomach twisted into knots. This was it. No turning back. I raised my hand and pounded on the door, hard. I heard a sudden silence, a brief rustling, and then footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly, and there he was, Daniel, shirtless, a look of confusion spreading across his face. He hadn't expected me. That much was clear. His eyes widened in shock, and then I saw her behind him, wrapped in a white hotel robe, her hair tousled, her face flushed. For a second, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. James? Her voice wavered, a mix of surprise and fear. She took a step back, clutching the robe tighter around her, as if that would somehow protect her from the reality crashing down around us. I stepped into the room, pushing past Daniel, who stood frozen in the doorway. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. "What the hell is this, Sophia?" She didn't answer right away, her eyes darting between me and Daniel. He finally found his voice, his tone defensive, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "Look, man, this isn't what you think." "Shut up," I snapped, turning my gaze back to her. "You don't get to talk right now." My voice was colder than I'd ever heard it, a tone I didn't know I was capable of. Sophia swallowed hard, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "James, please, I can explain." "Explain?" I barked, the anger spilling out of me like a flood. "Explain what, Sophia? How you've been fucking him behind my back? How long has this been going on?" She flinched at the harshness of my words, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd once promised me forever. But that moment passed as quickly as it came. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. 6 months. Maybe longer. I don't know. My heart shattered into a million pieces, the weight of her confession crashing down on me like a ton of bricks. 6 months. 6 fucking months. All the times I'd felt that gut-wrenching suspicion, all the nights I'd lain awake beside her, wondering if I was losing my mind. And here was the truth, staring me in the face. I turned to Daniel, who was still standing there like a deer caught in headlights. "Get out," I growled. "Get the fuck out now." He hesitated, looking to Sophia for some kind of signal, but she just stared at the floor, silent, broken. He grabbed his shirt and shoes, muttering something under his breath as he slipped past me and out the door. When he was gone, I turned back to her. "Why, Sophia? Why him? Why now?" She started to cry, her tears falling freely now. I don't know, James. I was lonely. I felt like we were drifting apart. You've been so distant lately, always wrapped up in work, and I needed someone who made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I scoffed, the rage boiling inside me. "So you thought screwing around with your coworker was the answer?" She didn't respond, just looked away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make her feel a fraction of the pain coursing through my veins. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "This isn't over," I said finally, my voice trembling with fury. "Not by a long shot." As I stormed out of the room, my mind was already spinning with ideas, plans, a need for revenge burning hotter than ever. They thought they could get away with this. They were wrong, so very wrong. When I left that hotel room, I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly through the city, my mind a hurricane of thoughts and emotions. The rage, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all mixed into a potent cocktail that made my hands grip the wheel so tightly I could feel the leather creaking under my fingers. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I couldn't just let this slide. No, not after what I'd seen. Not after what I'd heard. I wanted to make them pay, to make them suffer in ways they couldn't even imagine. My mind flashed to Sophia's face, her pathetic tears, the way she'd tried to justify her actions with excuses that fell flat. And then Daniel, with his smug, arrogant look, like he thought he'd won some kind of prize. I'd show them both what it meant to cross me. I ended up at a bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions, and everyone's looking to drown something: pain, regret, anger. I sat at the bar, ordered a double whiskey, and downed it in one gulp. I needed to clear my head, to think straight. I needed a plan. That's when it hit me. I pulled out my phone and called Mark, the investigator. He picked up after a couple of rings, his voice gruff and tired. "James," he said, "everything all right?" "Mark," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "I need you to help me with something else, something bigger." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him weighing his options. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to make their lives hell," I said bluntly. "I want you to dig deeper into Daniel's past. Find me something I can use. Anything. And I want to know everything about his life, his debts, his secrets, everything. Can you do that?" Mark chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "I can do that, James, but it'll cost you." "Money's not an issue," I shot back. "Just get me the dirt. The nastier, the better." He agreed and hung up, and I felt a strange calm wash over me. I'd put the wheels in motion. Now it was just a matter of time. I knew from the moment I saw them together that I wouldn't be content with just ending my marriage or walking away quietly. No, I needed to burn their world to the ground. The next day I went back to work, trying to act normal, pretending that everything was okay. But underneath the surface, I was watching, waiting, planning. I saw Sophia at breakfast, her eyes red and puffy, like she hadn't slept at all. Good. I hoped she tossed and turned all night, consumed by guilt and fear. She tried to talk to me, to say something, but I just nodded, pretending to listen. I had nothing to say to her. Not yet. That evening, Mark called me back. "I've got something," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Daniel's not as squeaky clean as he looks. He's got a bit of a gambling problem, owes some serious money to some less than reputable people. And there's more. His company car. Turns out it's registered under a fake name. I'm guessing he's done some things he doesn't want anyone to know about." A smile spread across my face. This was perfect. "What about Sophia?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Anything on her I can use?" "Not yet," Mark replied. "She's been careful, but give me time and I'll find something." "No," I said quickly. "Focus on Daniel for now. I've got other plans for her." I thanked Mark and hung up. The wheels were turning. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I wouldn't just expose them, I'd destroy them. I wanted them to lose everything they had. Their careers, their reputations, their peace of mind. I started with Daniel. I knew where he parked his car, the sleek, black Audi he always bragged about. One night, I waited until I was sure he was with Sophia at the hotel again. I made my way to his parking spot, the adrenaline surging through my veins like a drug. I brought a pocket knife with me, crouched down, and slashed all 4 of his tires, smiling at the thought of the look on his face when he'd find it. Then I moved to Sophia's car. I did the same, my anger channeled into every deep cut of the blade. By the time I was done, both cars were out of commission. But I wasn't finished. I called a tow truck using a burner phone and had Daniel's car taken to the other side of town. I made sure to leave it somewhere questionable, right in front of a dive bar known for its rowdy clientele. By the time I got home, I felt a strange satisfaction, a small step, but the first of many. I knew that when they left the hotel in the morning, they'd find a nasty surprise waiting for them. But what I didn't know was that my revenge was about to take an even darker turn. I was just getting started. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen, sipping my coffee, pretending to read the paper while Sophia moved around in silence. Her steps were light, cautious, as if she was afraid to make a noise. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup. She was nervous, on edge. Good. She had every reason to be. I didn't say much as she kissed me on the cheek, a quick, hesitant peck that barely touched my skin. I'm heading to the office early, she murmured, not meeting my gaze. There's a lot to catch up on. I nodded, feigning indifference. Sure. Do what you need to do. She paused, as if waiting for me to say something else, to ask if she was really going to work or if she was meeting him again. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I just turned back to the paper, pretending I didn't care, pretending I wasn't counting down the minutes until she'd discover what I'd done. The door closed behind her, and I waited a few seconds before I followed. I knew exactly where she was going, and I wanted to see her face when she found her car. I kept a safe distance, watching as she approached her sedan, the one she'd insisted on buying last year, a mid-range Lexus, sleek and shiny, a symbol of our supposed success. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw it. 4 flat tires sagging like deflated balloons on the cracked asphalt. I watched her expression shift from confusion to panic, her phone already in her hand. She started pacing, looking around, probably wondering if this was some kind of random act of vandalism, or if it was something more personal. And then, as if on cue, I saw Daniel coming around the corner. He looked annoyed, his brow furrowed, probably thinking he'd just deal with her car problem quickly before they slipped away for another day of secrecy. But then his face went pale as he realized his car wasn't there. He glanced around frantically, his mouth moving as if he were swearing under his breath. I watched them argue, their gestures becoming more animated as the realization hit them both. Sophia's hands flew up, her face red with frustration. I could only imagine what was being said. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, looking lost and helpless. Finally, Sophia seemed to convince Daniel to call a cab. I could see the tension in their faces, the suspicion starting to creep in. Maybe they thought they'd been targeted randomly. Maybe they were beginning to piece together that this wasn't some accident. But that was just the start of their bad day. I slipped away, headed for their office. I knew they'd end up there eventually, probably assuming they could figure out what to do once they were in the safety of their workplace. They didn't know what awaited them. An hour later, I was sitting in my car, parked a little down the street from their office building. I could see the entrance clearly, see the doorman looking bored as he held the door for the steady stream of employees coming and going. And then, I spotted them. Daniel and Sophia, getting out of a cab, both looking stressed, frazzled. Daniel's face was flushed with anger, his movements jerky as if he were still processing the events of the morning. They entered the building, and I waited. I knew it wouldn't take long, and it didn't. Not 5 minutes later, I saw 2 police cars pull up, lights flashing but no sirens. I felt a dark thrill run through me as 2 officers got out and hurried into the building. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I had timed everything perfectly, coordinated it all to the minute. I imagined the scene unfolding inside. The officers would be walking up to Daniel, asking him to come with them, to answer a few questions. At first he'd probably be confused, trying to assert his innocence, maybe even thinking this was all some mistake. But then the cop would pull out the handcuffs, his voice firm and authoritative. "Mr. Daniels, he'd say. "You're under arrest for a hit-and-run accident last night. 2 bikers were seriously injured. We have reason to believe your vehicle was involved and then fled the scene." I could almost see the color drain from Daniel's face, see the shock and panic set in. He'd stutter, try to explain that his car had been stolen, that he hadn't been anywhere near that area, that there had to be a mistake. But the cops wouldn't listen. They'd haul him away right in front of all his colleagues, with Sophia standing there, stunned and speechless. I knew she'd be terrified, her mind racing with questions. Did Daniel do this? Was he hiding something from her? Or was this some kind of setup? I could picture the fear in her eyes, the way she'd look around, wondering who else knew, who else was watching. But that was just the beginning. Daniel would spend hours at the station, trying to prove his innocence. Meanwhile, I had more in store. I'd made sure the footage from the hotel parking lot that night got misplaced, ensuring Daniel would have a hard time explaining anything. Sophia would start getting phone calls, emails, anonymous messages implying there was more to this story, things she didn't know, secrets he'd kept hidden from her. She'd begin to wonder if she'd ever really known him, if she could trust anything he'd ever said. And as for me, I was just getting started, laying the groundwork for the next stage of my revenge. They thought they'd been caught in a storm, but they had no idea. The real hurricane was still coming. The next few days were a blur of satisfaction and anticipation. I watched from the shadows as my plan began to take hold, each piece falling neatly into place like a game of chess I'd been playing for months. I stayed quiet, patient, letting them think they could figure their way out of the mess they'd found themselves in. Daniel spent most of the day in the police station, his face plastered across the local news. "Local ad exec arrested in hit-and-run scandal." The headlines flashed on my phone. I knew his so-called friends and colleagues would be gossiping about him, whispering behind closed doors, wondering if they'd ever really known him at all. The thought brought a twisted smile to my face. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Sophia. She went back to her office, pale and shaken, trying to pretend that everything was under control. She didn't know I had already laid the groundwork for the next move. I made a call to her boss, Mr. Flanders. I told him I was a concerned friend, just wanting to let him know about the rumors circulating around the office, that his precious employee, Sophia, had been having an affair with a colleague, someone who was now in deep legal trouble. I could hear the irritation in his voice, the slow realization that this could be a PR disaster for his firm. He thanked me for the tip, his tone as cold as a January morning. Later that afternoon, I got another call from Mark, my investigator. He had dug deeper into Daniel's background, and what he found was a treasure trove of sins. Not only did Daniel have a gambling problem, but he was also under investigation for embezzlement. He'd been siphoning money from a small side project, skimming just enough off the top to avoid immediate detection. But now, with the hit-and-run charges, the authorities were starting to take a closer look at everything. Perfect. I had a new card to play. That evening, I watched Sophia from my study as she sat on our bed, staring blankly at her laptop screen. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, her face lined with worry. I felt a twisted sense of pleasure seeing her like this, unraveled, lost. She was trying to reach Daniel, but he wasn't answering. I knew he wouldn't. He was too busy with his own problems, trying to stay out of jail, trying to clear his name, which was now thoroughly tainted. And of course, he had no idea that I was behind it all. I decided it was time to make my next move. The following morning, I left early, telling Sophia I had an important meeting. She barely responded, lost in her own world of panic and confusion. I drove to Daniel's apartment complex, parking a few blocks away. I knew he wouldn't be there. The police had him for at least another few hours. I made my way to his door, checking my surroundings to make sure no one saw me. Then, using a tool Mark had provided, he called it a bump key, I managed to pop the lock open. I stepped inside. the stale air of his apartment greeting me with the scent of old cologne and takeout. I didn't waste any time. I went straight for his desk, rummaging through papers, files, anything that looked remotely suspicious. And then I found it, a small black notebook, shoved into a drawer. I opened it to see a list of names, numbers, amounts. The evidence of his embezzlement was right there in his sloppy handwriting. I quickly snapped pictures of every page, my heart pounding with excitement. This was the nail in his coffin. I heard a noise from the hallway, a door opening, footsteps. I quickly shut the drawer and left the apartment as quietly as I had come, my mind racing with possibilities. This was exactly what I needed to destroy Daniel once and for all. That afternoon, I made an anonymous tip to the police, mentioning the notebook, dropping just enough hints to get them interested. They would raid his apartment soon, and when they did, they'd find everything they needed. Daniel's legal troubles would multiply tenfold. Back home, I found Sophia in the living room, looking pale and disheveled. She jumped when she saw me, as if my presence startled her. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. "What's wrong?" I don't know what's happening," she confessed, tears forming in her eyes. "Daniel's in so much trouble, and I don't know why. He says he didn't do anything, but now the police are investigating him for other things. I don't know what to believe anymore." I felt a sick satisfaction watching her crumble. "Maybe you should have thought about that before getting involved with him," I said coldly. She flinched at my words. "James, please. I'm sorry, I was confused. I made a mistake. I'm begging you. I need your help." For a moment, I just stared at her, letting the silence hang heavy between us. I could feel her desperation, her fear. She was cornered, trapped in the web I'd spun around her. And then I leaned forward, my expression hardening. "I'll help you, Sophia," I said slowly, "but on one condition." She looked at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "Anything, James. Please, just help me fix this." I let the words hang in the air for a moment longer, savoring her discomfort. "You're going to give me full access to your work email," I said. "I want to see everything you've been hiding from me. Every lie, every secret. If you do that, maybe, just maybe, I'll help you." Her face paled, her eyes widening with shock. "My work email? Why? That has nothing to do with— Do you want my help or not?" I snapped, cutting her off. "This is the deal. Take it or leave it." She hesitated, her hands shaking as she considered her options. Finally, she nodded, defeated. Okay, I'll do it." I smiled, knowing I had her exactly where I wanted her. And as she handed over her laptop, my mind raced with all the ways I would make her and Daniel pay for every lie, every betrayal. I took the laptop from her hands, feeling the weight of it settle into my palms like the final piece of a puzzle. Her eyes followed me as I carried it to the kitchen table, where I sat down and powered it on. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I could sense her anxiety, feel the tension radiating off her like a heat wave. She hovered near the doorway, arms crossed tightly, chewing on her lip like a guilty child waiting for punishment. "Password," I said flatly, my eyes never leaving the screen. She hesitated for a moment, her hesitation almost making me smile. "Sophia, 123, she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Of course, how original." I typed it in, and the screen unlocked, revealing her desktop, a chaotic mess of files, documents, emails. I started scrolling through her email inbox, my eyes skimming over subject lines, names, dates. I knew what I was looking for, and it didn't take long to find it. Emails from Daniel, stretching back months, flirtatious, casual, and then, slowly, they became more personal, more intimate. "Here we go," I muttered under my breath, opening one of the threads. I scrolled through quickly, reading their exchanges, plans for lunches, sneaking away from the office, cryptic mentions of the hotel. The further I read, the darker my thoughts became. They had been flaunting their little affair right under my nose, using company emails like a couple of teenagers who thought they'd never get caught. I glanced up at her, watching as she shifted uncomfortably. "These emails," I said, my voice deceptively calm. "This is how you've been spending your days? Trading love notes with your lover?" Her face flushed with shame. "James, please. It wasn't like that. We were just—" "Don't." I cut her off, my tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "Don't insult me by pretending it was anything less than what it was. You were fucking him. You're still fucking him, and you did it right under my nose." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, trying to find words that wouldn't make it worse. But I wasn't in the mood for her lies. I turned back to the screen, scrolling further, looking for something more damning, something I could use. And then I found it. An email from just 2 days ago, right before the night I'd confronted them. It was short, just a few lines, but it was enough to light a fire in my veins. "Daniel, can't wait to see you tonight. Room 312, usual time. I've got a surprise for you." My jaw tightened, my hands clenching around the laptop. They'd been planning their little tryst, right there, while I'd been sitting at home, suspecting nothing. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my voice calm. "You two planned to meet that night at the hotel," I said quietly. "You had a surprise for him?" She looked like she might collapse. "James, I—" "Shut up," I snapped, slamming the laptop shut with a loud bang. She flinched, her eyes wide and watery. "This is what you've been doing behind my back. All your bullshit about working late, about needing space, about finding yourself. It was all lies, wasn't it?" Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a scrape that echoed in the room. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice low and menacing. "You're going to send an email to your boss, Mr. Flanders, and you're going to resign. Today. Effective immediately." Her face drained of color. "What?" "No, James, I can't do that. My job—" "Your job?" I sneered. "Your job that you've turned into your personal playground? Your job that's become a joke because of you and Daniel? Believe me, they'll be better off without you. Now do it." She started to cry again, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. I pointed at the laptop. "Do it now, or I will. And I'll send every single one of these emails to the entire office, Mr. Flanders included. How do you think he'll feel about that?" She hesitated, her shoulders shaking as she reached for the laptop. Her fingers moved over the keyboard slowly, reluctantly. I watched her type out the email, each word a little victory in my war against her. Once it was done, I nodded. "Good. Now send it." She clicked send, her hand trembling. I felt a surge of power, a thrill of control. "Now," I continued, "I need you to tell me everything about Daniel's finances. Does he have any accounts you know about? Anything he's hiding? Tell me everything you know." She looked at me, confused, her brows furrowing. "Why? What are you planning to do?" I smiled, a cold, empty smile. "I'm planning to make sure he loses everything, just like you're about to." I spent the rest of the afternoon digging deeper. I didn't just want to ruin Daniel. I wanted to annihilate him. I wanted to take everything he had ever cared about, ever worked for, and turn it to ash. I sent out anonymous tips to his clients, his creditors, anyone who might be affected by his embezzlement. I made sure the rumors spread fast and far. I knew that soon enough, his entire world would come crashing down. As for Sophia, I watched her crumble before me. She was jobless now, her lover embroiled in a scandal, her marriage hanging by a thread. She had no idea how far I was willing to go, how much further I intended to take this. She'd thought this was the worst of it, but she hadn't seen anything yet. I had just begun to tighten the noose. I knew things were about to spiral out of control, and I savored every second of it. Daniel's arrest for the hit and run, the embezzlement charges stacking up. Everything was falling into place like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of chaos. The whispers about him in the office had grown into a chorus, each accusation piling up like a brick on his grave. His clients were pulling out. His so-called friends were distancing themselves, and the police were circling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Meanwhile, Sophia was in a state of quiet panic. She had nowhere to turn. She'd tried calling Daniel multiple times, but he was unreachable, too busy trying to dig himself out of the pit I'd thrown him into. I could tell she was starting to feel the walls closing in on her. She'd resigned, as I demanded, but that was just the beginning. Her phone rang constantly with calls from concerned colleagues and clients. She didn't have any answers for them, and she was terrified of what might come next. And so, I decided it was time to twist the knife a little deeper. I waited until the next morning, after she'd had another sleepless night. I watched her from across the breakfast table, her eyes puffy, dark circles etched under them. She looked a wreck, her hands trembling as she held her coffee mug. I knew she wouldn't be able to keep up the charade for much longer. "Sophia," I began, my voice calm, almost soothing. "There's something I need you to do for me." She looked up, her face full of dread. "What now?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Remember your friend Laura?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "The one you said you were staying with all those nights when you were really with him?" Her eyes darted away. "Yes. What about her?" "I want you to call her," I continued, "and tell her everything. I want you to explain how you've been lying to her, using her as a cover. I want her to know the truth, every dirty detail." She blinked, her mouth opening in shock. "James, no. I can't do that. She's my friend. She'll what?" I interrupted, my voice cold as ice. "Find out what kind of person you really are? See you for the liar and cheat you've become?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was beyond caring. "Call her," I demanded. "Now, or I will." With a deep, shuddering breath, she reached for her phone. I watched as she dialed, her fingers trembling. When Laura picked up, I could hear her cheerful voice through the speaker, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Hey, Sophia!" Laura's voice chirped. "How are you?" Sophia swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Laura, there's something I need to tell you. I've been lying to you. About everything. All those nights I said I was with you. I wasn't. I was with Daniel. I've been having an affair with him for months." The silence on the other end was palpable, thick with shock and disbelief. "What?" Laura finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you serious?" "Yes," Sophia sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Laura. I never meant to drag you into this. I was stupid and selfish, and now everything is falling apart." Laura's voice hardened, cutting through the air like a knife. "I trusted you, Sophia. I defended you when people talked behind your back, and you used me? You're disgusting. Don't ever call me again." The line went dead, and Sophia crumbled, the phone slipping from her hands as she buried her face in her palms. She sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt a dark thrill watching her come undone, but I knew I couldn't let her wallow for too long. I had more plans for her, more steps in this dance of destruction. I stood up, walked over to her, and put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, looking up at me with wide, red-rimmed eyes. "Please, James," she whispered. "I've done everything you've asked. When does it stop?" I leaned down, my face inches from hers, my voice low and calm. "It stops when I say it stops. And we're far from done. I've taken your job, your friends. Now I want your reputation." She blinked, confusion clouding her eyes. "What do you mean?" "You're going to call your parents," I said, "and you're going to tell them everything. I want them to know what kind of daughter they raised. I want them to hear it from you." She stared at me in horror, her breath hitching. "No! Please, James, not them." They're old. They won't understand. I straightened up, my smile devoid of warmth. Call them, Sophia. Or I will. She looked at me like she was staring at a stranger, her face twisted in despair. Slowly, she reached for the phone again, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely dial. I waited as she dialed the number, my heart beating steadily in my chest. She was breaking down, piece by piece, and I was there to witness it all. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was retribution, a cleansing fire to burn away every last trace of the betrayal she had inflicted on me. As she put the phone to her ear, waiting for her parents to answer, I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her, trapped, isolated, and utterly broken. I watched as Sophia sat there, clutching the phone to her ear, her eyes filled with sheer terror. Her breath came in shallow gasps, like she was about to faint. I could hear the faint, crackling voice of her mother on the other end, filled with warmth and concern. That voice had always annoyed me, too sweet, too meddlesome, but now it felt like a blade, sharpening itself on Sophia's guilt. "Mom, it's me," she started, her voice breaking, barely above a whisper. Her mother's response was immediate, a flurry of questions and love, asking what was wrong, why she sounded like she'd been crying. I leaned in closer, making sure she felt my presence, my eyes boring into hers. "I need to tell you something," she continued, her voice trembling. "Something I've been hiding. I've been having an affair with a man at work for months now, and James found out." The line went silent for a moment, and then I heard her mother gasp, a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Sophia, what are you saying? What have you done?" Sophia's tears flowed freely, each drop a testament to the betrayal she had sown. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I've ruined everything. I don't know what to do anymore." I could hear her mother's voice crack, her father's gruff tones chiming in from the background, demanding to know what was going on. I imagined the looks on their faces, the shock, the pain, the utter disappointment in their daughter. They had always adored her, always thought she could do no wrong. This would shatter them. I let her linger in that torment for a few more moments, then I took the phone from her hand. "Sophia is going to need some time," I said calmly. "She's made some terrible choices, and now she's facing the consequences. I think it's best if you give her some space to figure out how to make amends." Before they could respond, I hung up, tossing the phone onto the table. Sophia was a mess, her face buried in her hands, her sobs muffled. I felt no pity, no remorse. She had brought this on herself, and I was simply finishing what she had started. "Now that they know," I said, my voice low and deliberate, "I think it's time we talk about our future, Sophia." She looked up, her face streaked with tears, confusion flashing across her features. "Our future?" she croaked, as if the concept itself were foreign to her now. "Yes," I replied, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "The future where you're no longer a part of my life, where you're left to deal with the wreckage you've created. But before that happens, I have one more thing I want you to do." Her eyes widened with a new kind of fear. "What more could you possibly want from me?" I smirked, savoring the moment. "I want you to confess publicly. Write a letter, an email, something that goes to all your friends, your colleagues, everyone. I want them to know exactly what kind of person you are. No more hiding, no more secrets." She shook her head violently. "No, I can't. I can't do that. You're asking too much. You've taken everything from me already, James. Please stop." I stepped closer, my tone icy. "I will stop when I'm satisfied, and right now I'm not. I want the world to see you for what you are. I want you to feel what it's like to be stripped of your dignity, to be left with nothing." She slumped back in her chair, utterly defeated, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes, the last remnants of resistance slowly being crushed under the weight of my demands. Finally, she nodded, a small, broken gesture of surrender. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll do it." I smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Good. Make it count." She turned to her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. She began typing, each keystroke a painful concession, a piece of herself she would never get back. I watched the screen, the words forming, each one laced with her shame and regret. To all of you who know me, I am writing this to confess a terrible truth. I have been unfaithful to my husband for months, betraying his trust and breaking my vows. I know that this news will come as a shock to many of you, and I do not ask for your forgiveness. I have hurt those I love most, and I must now live with the consequences of my actions. I read over her shoulder, feeling a grim satisfaction as she poured her guilt onto the screen. She wrote about her affair with Daniel, her lies, the deceit, the moments she'd hurt people who had trusted her. With each sentence, I felt a sense of closure slowly building in my chest, a feeling that this chapter of my life was finally nearing its end. When she finished, she hovered over the send button, her hand shaking uncontrollably. "Do it," I urged, my voice barely a whisper. "Send it." She closed her eyes, drew in a shaky breath, and clicked. The message flew out into the digital void, reaching all the people who once thought they knew her. Her face crumpled as if she were a building imploding from within. I watched her collapse in on herself, and for a moment I felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just an empty, hollow feeling where my heart used to be. I had destroyed her, utterly and completely, as I had promised myself I would. And yet, the satisfaction I had craved felt strangely elusive. I turned away, leaving her alone in the kitchen, a broken figure hunched over the table. I needed some air, some space to clear my head. As I stepped outside, the cold evening air hit my face, sharp and biting. I stared up at the sky, the clouds hanging heavy and low, and wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. I had won, but at what cost? And then my phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from an unknown number. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. "You think this is over? Think again. You have no idea what's coming." Daniel. He had found a way to reach out, even from the mess I had put him in. And he was angry. A smile slowly spread across my face. Maybe this wasn't over after all. Maybe the game was just beginning.